Welcome to Behind the Investigation. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First, and I'm joined today by Senator Josh Mclaurin. He represents the 14th District here in Georgia in the state Senate. That is essentially North Fulton. Thanks for being with us today, Senator.
Thank you, Brendan.
So today we're tackling a really difficult issue, one that we exposed as part of our investigative series called Shielded. It's about police domestic violence. We're also looking at domestic violence more broadly, and we're also providing resources to people who may be experiencing family violence in their own home so they can get help. That's all available right now on atlantanewsfirst.com/shielded. You can see it right at the top of our homepage. And Senator, this is a difficult issue to address because we're talking about a very personal relationships within police officers' homes. You know, police officers are human beings. They have issues just like the rest of us, and in some cases that involves the police responding to their home. After viewing our series, is there anything that sticks out in terms of things that may or may not have a legislative issue that can be addressed?
Well, thanks, Brendan. To what you just said, the point is that family violence is hard to deal with as a society without even the angle of a police officer being involved. Mm-hmm. It can be really difficult when police respond to a scene to get the story straight. Oftentimes, the person who calls for help because they need it is not as agile in trying to explain what happened, and sometimes the aggressor, the person who's committing the violence, gets the upper hand in trying to recruit the police to be on their side. I've seen it firsthand in practicing, so already you're dealing with a basket of really difficult issues. When you add the layer of police officers who themselves could be responsible for misconduct and for threatening their families or for loved ones in their family, it gets way harder to deal with. And I think your investigation does a really good job of highlighting the difficulties, not just the awkwardness among fellow officers who have to respond potentially to a colleague who's committed a pretty heinous crime, but then the layers of unaccountability that can result if you don't have leadership in place in these departments and these organizations that are willing to step up and do the right thing and make sure that their own officers are held accountable. So, from a state legislative standpoint, something that I have advocated for before, and I think a lot of my colleagues would like to see, is a ban on rehiring. If an officer gets dismissed from one department because of almost any kind of misconduct, you would prohibit other police departments inside the state from rehiring them, just a different department down the road. That's one way that officers who do engage in misconduct often get missed by the system and end up perpetrating more harm somewhere else. But in order to get to that point, you have to have a police department that's actually willing to dismiss an officer in the first place. And so, part of the conversation I'm glad that we're having today is how do we make sure that police departments in the state of Georgia have the culture that they need, the legal tools that they need to swiftly ensure accountability for officers who engage in this misconduct.
You bring up a good point, because in the cases that we uncovered, there at least was some response that created a public record. By definition, the most egregious cases would be the ones we don't even know about, where a police officer responded to a fellow officer's home and took no action, because under Georgia law, there's a law that I think the General Assembly struck the right tone. The intent was very good. The law in the books basically says, in the official code of Georgia annotated, that if the police respond to someone's home and it's a domestic, that's the call, it's family violence, but there actually is no violence. No crime was committed. It's just an argument. Hey, look, we've all had arguments. And if there isn't a crime committed, there's no violence or threat of violence, there's no public interest in what's going on behind that closed door. What the General Assembly said is a report has to be made, but if there's no crime, that report is effectively sealed. It's not subject to the Open Records Act, so people like me or the neighbors can't see what's going on behind closed doors, but at least there's a record, so if there's a future police response to that home, there's at least some sort of record for pattern to see if this is something that's a continuum that might lead to violence. So again, I think the General Assembly struck a really good balance between privacy and the public's right to know, but that could create a perverse incentive for a police officer who knows that law and says, you know what, if I don't make an arrest here, or if I just do a regular report and say there was no crime committed, then that means the body camera and at least the police report and possibly the body camera and other evidence would not be subject to the Records Act. I mean, it's not clearly the intent of the General Assembly for that to have been the case, but to go back to my original statement, we don't know what we don't know. And as a result, there may be these incidents, and I've already gotten a few tips since we've run the story, that there are incidents where no action was taken. And that goes back to your point about the culture of a police department. The leadership from the top has to be, hey, look, we treat domestic violence the same, whether it's a sworn law enforcement officer or whether it's a regular citizen, because no one's above the law.
That's right. I mean, obviously, again, more challenging and difficult issues. And really what this comes down to is trust. Can the public trust that a police department is going to do what it needs to do internally to ensure that officers who are threatening their families, threatening themselves in some cases, don't still have a gun and a badge and aren't responsible for ensuring public safety? And the problem is, if you don't have a department that has that culture of leadership at the top, where they're willing to hold their own officers accountable, then we have to rely on mechanisms like open records requests, other forms of public accountability, so that your organization, the news, the public at large can stay abreast of what's happening in these departments. What I would like to see is a much more robust set of internal controls required statewide, so that individual police departments have reporting requirements, even if there's not a public arrest report, for example, that details, like you say, it could just be that a fight gets out of control, emotions get heated, but there's not as much risk as, say, a situation where you need an arrest, and everybody's entitled to their privacy. But what you might want to do is have a mandatory reporting mechanism where just the fact that there was a call or the officer's name is at least stored internally, so that for internal disciplinary purposes later, for public accountability purposes, there's some record, and the officers don't just have an incentive to bury that it happened in the first place.
Yeah, you make a good point. See, the Georgia Post told us, Chris Harvey, the assistant director, was very forthcoming. He said, look, sometimes we have to use this special probation. And to get technical about it, what they do is the probable cause committee of the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, or Council, decides, yes, there's probable cause that this was a family violence incident, but we're going to revoke the certification of the officer, but then we're going to suspend that revocation for a probationary period. And that was the tool that Georgia Post used most in the cases that they gave us when we asked for cases for 2 years. And I asked, why probation? Why not revoke? Why not take that officer's certification? And what they said was, the problem is the survivors of domestic violence very often do not want to testify against their loved one. And that's part of the victimology, because their lives are so intertwined that even by the time officers get to a domestic violence scene, very often the survivors no longer want to press charges. That's the criminal side. But on the Peace Officer Standards and Training Certification side, that also means they're not going to testify in a revocation proceeding. And they're saying basically the Attorney General told them, hey, look, go with probation, because this is not going to survive an appeal that we're going to have to defend on your behalf. That sounds like a lot of inside baseball, but the net effect is that those officers keep their jobs, they keep their badges, and most importantly, they keep their guns. And the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation, according to the Georgia Commission on Domestic Violence, increases the lethality of such an event by 500%. And we saw instances where judges crossed out by hand the restriction on firearms possession while awaiting trial, which kept the gun in the home so the officer could keep their job. Is that concerning to you?
It is, and I think there's two cultural forces broadly in the state of Georgia that it can explain that to some extent. First is that political leadership in the state has made it clear that they want to increase access to guns, expand that access as much as possible, even if large majorities of Georgians oppose unrestricted gun rights and think that there should be some common sense basic limits. And so politically, judges, legislators have a really hard time trying to take guns from people, especially from police officers. And that's the second piece of the cultural problem, is that you have these really strong bonds among police, and other states you have police unions, but basically organizations that are dedicated to solidarity among police. And unfortunately, there are some of these organizations or groups of people who are all about defending police literally no matter what, even if police engage in misconduct. And that's the mentality you see in some of these departments, right? That they've got their colleagues back and they want to support their colleague no matter what. I understand that that it's a tough job. I mean, it's one of the hardest jobs we have. You know, the rates of PTSD, the amount of really dangerous situations that we ask our first responders to go into as a society on a daily basis. It's understandable why there's such a strong culture of having each other's back. But we need to be supporting police in other ways, not unaccountability for misconduct that individual officers engage in. And I think that, you know, you hear both Democrats and Republicans talk about the wages that police make, the fact that we ask police to go into mental health situations that they may not be specifically trained for, and try to throw them at all of society's problems instead of just the ones they're specifically trained for. And you start to understand why some police feel like we don't have their back. But if we were better about the whole picture, if we were able to train police how to do de-escalation, how to handle only those public safety situations that they need to handle, and not put them in harm's way so often, if they understood that the institution, the people, the local governments had their back, I think they'd feel a lot more confidence in saying that their fellow officers need to be held accountable when they do something wrong. So I think there's a balanced approach here that people in elected office have to take, which is to understand that, you know, while it's understandable while police want to stick together in difficult situations, that does not go so far as to allowing police to lie or protect their colleagues, cover up misconduct, and in the worst cases threaten or seriously injure or kill loved ones or others just because they have the badge and the gun. And so that balance is really tricky to strike.
And that's not a hypothetical, because we showed examples where police officers had murdered their spouses, and this was after the police had already responded to their home on one or more domestic violence cases, and they were allowed to keep their guns, and they used those department-issued or at least sidearm that they would carry on the job weapons to then commit murder. And no one's saying that this is, you know, a pervasive problem throughout law enforcement. We're only looking at these specific instances. But statistically, there's about 5 domestic violence calls for when you reverse engineer a murder like that. I don't mean to be so cold and calculating about it, but statistically, when you take a family violence murder, there are 4 previous calls typically that preceded that murder where a homicide could have been prevented if the right action was taken by the system. And in the case of police officers, if a favor is done, it's really not a favor. That's what Steve Searcy said. He was a former lieutenant from Montgomery, Alabama, who told us he called his unit the homicide prevention unit, not the domestic violence unit, because he said they went to the home of a fellow officer 3 different times and they gave him a break by not writing a report, and then he ended up killing himself with his department-issued weapon over a family violence incident.
Right.
And he said, we're not doing that officer any favors. So the reason I say all that is, isn't it pro-law enforcement to help law enforcement families to keep them safe?
That's exactly right. One of the things that frustrates me about the messaging surrounding guns, policing, you name it, in the state of Georgia, is that, you know, there are a lot of people who think that the conservative thing to do is to always support more expanded gun rights, protections for police in all cases, and it's very one-sided. What most people want, no matter what your political affiliation is balance and accountability and public safety. It is a net decrease in public safety when a police officer who is prone to mental health issues or misconduct is given a gun, repeatedly ignored when they're in crisis and causing problems within their own family, and then ultimately does something tragic, right? That decreases public safety dramatically, not just for the family who has to experience that tragic event directly, but for the broader public that is being served by a police department that has a culture of unaccountability. Because you can be guaranteed that if an officer is allowed to get away with these incidents and the warning signs are ignored, that means that they're able to go to other situations, potentially inflict harm on other people outside their family, and it means that you've got a department where people are afraid of higher-ups, afraid of other colleagues, and basically afraid of the truth and afraid of the general public who they serve. So when we talk about accountability for police departments, this is not a decrease in public safety. What we're doing is we're taking out the sort of, you know, cancerous parts of a police department's culture, making sure that they don't infect the rest of the culture, and making sure that all of us are more safe as a result.
Well, I mean, not to get into the details of what happened in Union City, because your knowledge of it is only as deep as our reporting. So I'm not going to ask you to opine on what happened there, except to say that in that particular case, you had 2 police officers who believed that because they held a fellow commander accountable, their careers were effectively ended or at least negatively affected, whereas the alleged perpetrator who had his charges dropped saw his career unaffected. He's still a lieutenant, and the one lieutenant who didn't arrest him the night of the incident was promoted to captain eventually. So what message does it send to a police department when those who try to hold commanders accountable see their careers negatively affected and those who don't get promoted? Doesn't that send a message, generally speaking, that, hey, this is our culture, we protect our own, and if you break that sort of blue wall of silence, you're going to pay?
That's right. I mean, that's literally the opposite of the type of dynamic that we want in these police departments across the state. We want individual officers who hold their colleagues accountable to know that first and foremost, their supervisors and chief have their back, which also means that their local government, who is funding them and employing them, has their back, which also means that the broader community at large has their back in enforcing the law, no matter who you are. If any one of those links is broken, that's what allows a culture of unaccountability to fester, and it allows individual officers to believe that if they do the right thing, if they hold someone accountable and try to prevent harm, that they're going to suffer as a result. And those incentives are obviously backwards.
Well, you heard me ask the chief, how can your department arrest anyone for family violence if members of your command staff get a pass? That's what I asked her. She disagreed with my sort of framing of that. But the bottom line is, if I'm arrested, or anyone's arrested for domestic violence in Union City, can't they say, hey, how can you prosecute me when your own command staff doesn't get prosecuted?
That's right. And so you have that legitimacy problem within departments in terms of differential treatment among different officers. You also have that legitimacy problem with the public at large. I mean, post-summer of 2020, we've had a crisis in the legitimacy of policing. There are large groups of people who, especially those black and brown communities disproportionately affected by over-policing, they've lost trust for our policing as an institution at a basic level. And it only harms that trust and that legitimacy even more when we allow this type of unaccountability to fester.
Let me flip the script and say, let's say I'm a police officer and I've been wrongfully accused of family violence. There are documented cases where spouses, men or women, have falsely accused the other in order to gain leverage in a custody dispute. That leverage becomes even greater if it's going to end a law enforcement officer's career just by the accusation. So now they're in front of a magistrate getting bond conditions, and the magistrate says, you know what, I'm going to take your gun away because we always take guns away from people awaiting trial for family violence, or at least that judge does. And then they take the officer's gun, and now that officer is out of a job. How do we address that part of it? Because they shouldn't be treated any differently than any other domestic violence suspect. But the effects of how we treat them are different, because if you take their gun away, they lose their job.
So again, this is one of the most difficult problems, I think, in this whole discussion. And a couple basic principles guide my answer on this. For one thing, we have the system we have in terms of the legal system, the judiciary. When somebody swears out a complaint or makes a sworn statement to an officer or a judge, that person has to stand by that, and they're at risk of being prosecuted for perjury if it ends up that they lied, right? And so if people are bringing false testimony against their spouses, whether they're a police officer or not, that's a very serious matter, and the system has some mechanisms to try to respond to that. But the other thing is, at the end of the day, this just comes down to managing uncertainty. If we're not sure who's right and who's telling the truth, what's the bigger risk? I unfortunately think that leaving a weapon in the hands of somebody who's unstable, a threat to themselves and others, is more likely to be a risk in that situation than the risk that somebody would upend their own life, turn their family upside down just to swear out a false statement. Now, that can happen, but as we see with other types of policy issues where people have to report, like sexual assault or crimes against them, it's very difficult to report. It's very difficult to blow the whistle on somebody, and we have to trust that in most cases, when somebody's willing to upend their life to make a report like that, they're not doing it frivolously or just to gain advantage in a proceeding. But that's why we have due process. That's why we go through the system of fact-finding, and we have judges who are competent to hear testimony and decide what's really happening.
Yeah, that makes sense. One last question I want to ask you about is something called the Lautenberg Amendment. It's federal law. It has been for some 25 years, that says that if someone is convicted of a misdemeanor that has as an element family violence, they cannot possess a firearm for the rest of their lives. We already have nationwide and here in Georgia the disability to possess a firearm for any felony conviction, generally speaking, unless you get that reinstated. This says it's also a misdemeanor a conviction that has family violence as an element, you cannot possess a firearm. And specifically in that federal Lautenberg Amendment, there is no exemption for police or military. And this has ended police officers and military members' careers for acts of family violence. It has taken their guns away. Georgia is one of only 10 states, the other 40 states have this law, have a state law that mirrors that sort of buttresses that with a state law that local law enforcement can enforce. Georgia does not. And granted, it was a caucus bill, but you co-sponsored SB 119 that would fix that. And it's been proposed pretty much every year, and right now it's languishing in committee. Do you see any hope of that getting out of committee so Georgia could be in line with the 40 states and federal law?
You know, I mentioned a minute ago that Georgia has a political culture of, at least at the moment, expanding gun rights beyond any sort of reasonable limit. Large majorities of Georgians support basic, universal controls on gun ownership and access, like universal background checks, red flag laws, which I think are relevant to our discussion if somebody's in crisis, to get a temporary judicial intervention to make sure that they don't have access to weapons, again, temporary, and safe storage laws. And I think this falls into that category too. If you're a convicted abuser or somebody who engages in domestic violence at a misdemeanor or felony level, that means that a jury or a court has found you beyond a reasonable doubt guilty of being a risk to potentially yourself and others. And in cases like that, I don't think it's too extreme a sanction to make sure that that person doesn't have access to the firearms they would need to seriously hurt other people. And I think the majority of Georgians agree with that. Unfortunately, we're in the political stranglehold of an extreme set of voices that think that all gun rights should be unrestricted. And I'm confident, knowing my district and the campaigns that I've run and the voters I've talked to, that common sense, basic reforms like this make sense.
Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us. Is there anything else you want to add, since this is a less formal interview?
Sure. Well, I think that you're doing really important work shining a light on this. I mean, we've had such polarizing discussions in this country on a range of issues in the last few years, for this or against this, and people leave very little room for nuance a lot of times. This is a really serious issue where people have really strong opinions, either for or against police sometimes, and I think that it's important to have a level-headed discussion where we talk about the practical reality of holding police accountable in these limited cases.
Thanks so much again for joining us. And I want to remind those watching live or watching this on a stream later that you can go to atlantanewsfirst.com/shielded. It's also at the very top of atlantanewsfirst.com, either on the app or on our website. And you can get resources. There's a Georgia hotline and a national hotline. It's 24 hours. If you are experiencing family violence, or someone you love or know is experiencing family violence, you can get immediate resources so that you can escape that situation and also get support so you have the ability to escape that situation before it turns into something far more violent or deadly. Thanks again for joining us. This has been Behind the Investigation on Atlanta News First Plus.